How will people remember you? Did you live a meaningful life, seeking adventure? Did you live passively, just going through the motions? Everything we do in this life is creating a result of how we will be known. So what has your attention? What is leading your life? Everything we do is an act of worship, whether we realize it or not. John 4:23 says, "But the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him." Jesus was saying that we don't have to travel to a building to worship him, but we have the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, in us that allows us to worship him everywhere we go, at any time we want. And so at the end of my life, I want to look back and see a life of great sacrifice, one that is full of meaning and one that is full of purpose. I'm Aaron.
My name's Garrett.
And I'm Alec.
Join us as we go beyond the veil.
Welcome back to Beyond the Veil. This is a podcast where we discuss the access and availability of God that we have and how we utilize that. We know that it's a fully available relationship, and so we want to go to the depths of that. And then we have a season format where we go over a larger theme, and then we break that down into some episodes. And this season's big theme is recovering the face, to get that connection of God. And so that term, face-to-face, is what really sparked it, and it's about connection and the presence, and it just means to be before someone. And so that's kind of the bigger thing we've been looking at. Today we actually have a bonus episode, and so in our bonus episodes we're actually doing kind of like interviews or just bigger discussions with some of our friends, some people we know, to break down some topics that are kind of hitting in that sphere. And so today we have our friend Aaron Doyle with us. He is a worship leader. He's our roommate. And Alec, you want to give him a quick introduction of what you know about him?
Yeah, he's great. That's it.
Yeah.
No.
I'll take it.
No, he's extremely talented, and a pianist and a guitarist and a vocalist and all that jazz. Just really knows how to encounter the Holy Spirit when he's worshiping. So it's an honor to have you on the show with us.
It's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So what is your description you'd give yourself if we're talking about worship today? We're talking about going beyond the veil and getting recognizing the full connection we have with God. What's one thing you want people to know about you?
I think it's that I really feel like a child when I worship. And it just reminds me of whenever I was younger, just learning first how to play instruments. And that's where I spent a lot of alone time with God. And so I just feel like a child when I worship in a good way. And I just have fun with it. And I think it's fun to worship with others. So.
Yeah, taking the seriousness out of it, which
is
really interesting about you, because it's like taking the seriousness. And what I mean by that is actually taking the need to perform out of it. And rather being able to go into it freely without worry about what it looks like or sounds like, and which is a little ironic because it sounds amazing when you do it and you're really good at it. And my room's somewhat above Aaron's, and I hear him playing his music all night long, and it sounds beautiful, so I fall asleep to it.
Thank you.
But yeah, so we're just talking about what it means to be a worshiper today, and the theme overall, it's just a life of worship. We want to go, what does it look like, not just to do worship in a church service, not just to have a worship night at the house or whatever that looks like, but what does it look like to have a life of worship? And so I just want to set kind of a stage for this and say, this is the truth that I recognize about everything we do in the physical. And I think it's a great way to look at a lot of the things that we think we're doing that are very spiritual, and that we're maybe causing things to happen, and go, actually, most often our physical act, our physical experience is a response to the spiritual. It's our spirit interacting with God's spirit, and most importantly, his spirit just intervening in our life and convincing us of his goodness. And so I want to say that I think that's part of one of the principles of worship too, is just to go, it may be a physical expression, but it's not a physical act. It's a physical response, but it's not a physical cause. It's actually a response to what's happening in the spiritual and what we see in the room. And so, yeah, that's kind of the groundwork I'm going to lay for what worship is. And so, yeah, we can say there's a lot of mechanisms of worship. There's a lot of things people do, a lot of ways people do it. But the bottom line is, like, in the middle of it, as the Spirit's interacting with our spirit, we're being transformed simply by the infatuation of Him, simply by the connection to Him. And so we have a couple of kind of main points to look at what a life of worship looks like and how we want to really get into that. Kind of one of the first things we want to do is, well, we got to define worship. And so I would love for you to kind of give us that really good base of defining what really is worship, Aaron.
Yeah, I think worship to me is it's an act of sacrifice. And so it's sacrificing for something that you desire or like really believe in. And so whether you believe it or not, you worship something. You worship something every day. And so some people worship their career, they worship their self-appearance, they worship money, they worship sex, they worship tons of different things. And so each person is willing to sacrifice an ounce of their life to get things that they desire. And so in worship, I feel as though that you're just laying everything out in front of God and you're sacrificing your time and your energy, however it might look. And it doesn't always look like a piano or a guitar singing, but it might look like you just working out or even sharing the gospel at work because you're putting yourself on the line. Yeah. And so it's an act of sacrificing who you are for all that He is.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Alec?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that wholeheartedly because, oftentimes we can get so caught up in, like, what's really going on in worship. And so I know for me, it's like, hey, I'm just singing this song or, like, I'm hitting this drum or whatever. And I have to kind of, like, find my heart. And it's like, okay, am I, like, actually, like, positioned towards God right now? Or am I kind of, like, moving towards something else? So I think it's really good what you said about, like, everything being an act of worship and, like, being conscious of what you're actually worshiping and, like, where your heart is positioned in those moments.
Yeah, which I think is the really important factor for worship is the truth is you're probably doing it of something. And so it's very similar to kind of this quote we've talked about before in the past of what C.S. Lewis writes, and he says, people are really familiar with practicing the presence of God. And they understand that term, that it's to acknowledge God and all these things and to feel it. But what they don't realize is it's a dichotomy. You're either practicing the presence of God or you're practicing the absence. You're either acknowledging Him there or acknowledging Him not being there. And so the same thing is true about worship. You're either worshiping God or you're giving your affection to something else because, like, we were designed to be in that relationship and connection.
That's good, Garrett.
Yeah, thanks, bro. It's yeah. And so I'll just have a couple of statements about that to add and then try to see some more of your point of view on that. In the context of our connection with God, worship isn't simply an act of expression, but a response to what is. It's our gaze narrowing in on the one who captivates us. And so faith, and to correlate with the worship part of it, is our being convinced by God of His goodness. So this makes worship a natural response to His convincing. The byproduct of faith is worship. And this is like what I would say in a very sentence of what worship is. It's our very being experiencing God's goodness and responding in joy and gratitude. And so we can choose to try to retract that experience, try to numb it, try to draw our attention elsewhere to hide for whatever reason it may be. And there's many of them. And we can try to experience goodness and joy elsewhere. But we'll find that we'll probably lack the gratitude part because it's hard to be thankful when you know it's just not it. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think being grateful in the midst of worship can be really hard because I think back to whenever I was a kid and I'd spend time at the piano and I'd just worship and I was still learning piano, but I would take so much joy in just being alone in my living room or alone at the church that I lived across the street from playing piano. And I think of all the times I, just had bad days.
Yeah.
And those were always the days that I ended up being at the piano by myself. And so I think what you said about our response and like how worship can be our response to things. Looking back as a kid, my response to a bad day or a hardship was always worship. And so it just changed the course of my life. And so even now being this old, like I didn't realize that until like a year and a half ago, that 10-year-old Aaron, his response to a bad day was worship. And so it just changes the course of everything for you. And I think if you make the decision to intentionally go worship God, even on your really bad days, he shows up every time just because, you know, he's just that good.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something really interesting about kind of where you're going with that, about this response factor of how we're responding to God, because we know he's always present, always communicating, and always trying to make himself evident. And so I think maybe even we could make it this way, where the difference between worshiping God and something else is all like God-based, where we're either giving him our affection and joy and gratitude, or we're choosing to go, hey, I don't want to respond to that. It's actually the choice not to respond to it. And so everything we do is a response. It's just a matter of what kind of response is it. And so, you kind of talked in the beginning about, in the monologue, about this idea of a true worshiper.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to go there. If we're talking about
let's
this idea of a worshiper being this response to experiencing God's goodness, then what does Jesus mean when he's talking about God's looking for true worshipers?
What's so crazy about this is when I think of Jesus telling, because it's a Samaritan woman that he's talking to, and so he's asking her to pretty much get him water from the well, and then she's like, oh, well, why would you ask me to serve him, you know? And so it's just a crazy scenario that Jesus finds himself in, like all the other ones, pretty much.
Yeah.
But he mentions true worshiper, and I think back to, like, you know, in the beginning of the Bible, we literally see the image of someone who's not a true worshiper. And it's the devil. It's Lucifer.
Yeah.
And it says he was the greatest worshiper of all time. You know, he played instruments and sang better than all the other angels. Yet he wanted to pretty much, his desire was to be God and not, you know, serve God. And so I think that's why Jesus said, my God seeks people who will worship me. Because Lucifer, and it gives me chills thinking about it, because Lucifer wasn't a person who was seeking to worship God. And so we have an option. And so I think a true worshiper is completely the opposite of what we see in the beginning of the Bible, is someone who takes all their talent, everything they're good at, and says, I want to put this into who I am and build my own kingdom. But a true worshiper is someone who looks at their talents, their gifts, who they are, their influence, their favor, and they say, I want to use all this and build God's kingdom.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what a true worshiper is.
That's really good. Yeah, I think we were talking about earlier about like responses and stuff too. Another part of being a true worshiper is like, God, I'm not just going to worship you when I'm like happy or like, you know, in the mood to, but it's like, God, even if I'm not in that like mindset of worship, even if I'm like, you know, just really sad about something or, just not necessarily like in a positive mood, I'm still going to go and like find you in it and like be able to worship you in it. Last night I had one of those and I like came down to the piano and just like playing and just started singing a song. And I was like, wow, I feel so much better, even though I didn't feel great before. Now just like entering into worship with the Lord. And it's like, whatever that connection between us is, he took away everything that I was feeling and replaced it with his peace and joy in that moment. And so I think that's like really representative of a true worshiper too, of like, God, even if I don't feel like it right now, I'm still going to.
Right.
Yeah. And what's really cool about that text is you actually like see the Trinity in it, with Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman. He says, in spirit and in truth, like you're going to worship God. And so in spirit, Holy Spirit, in truth, Jesus, you're going to worship the Father.
Right.
And so there's actually this really cool thing going on here where, and I think you can make it one of the central messages of the gospel. Actually, it is like the message of the gospel is the Trinity, the dance of the three in one. They have this shared life going on, and the whole point is we were made to be joined into the dance. We were made to be joined into what's going on with the life and life to the full. And so true worshipers aren't simply someone that's going to go, yeah, have my life, do what you want with it, let me sacrifice. It's actually very much how people worship the gods they made in their own image. The images of gold and bronze and materials. The God that made us in his image actually made us to be joined in with him to experience life into life to the full with the
Right.
dance of the Trinity. And so it's this inclusion that's going on. And so what is our response to inclusion? It's to be so excited and so joyful and grateful. And sometimes it may not be necessarily expressed that way because of circumstance or what's going on in our lives. But the spiritual response is, wow, like this is what I was made for. And so I love that like the true worshiper, man, we were made to experience God, and he is gift of love. He's agape love.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the point. Like, let's get into the mindset of, oh my goodness, like there's no division or separation. There's no sacrifice to get to God, but rather this is giving of myself kind of sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's not this, let me give something to get something sacrificed. It's this, let me give myself to you as you give yourself to me. And then that's the experience that's going on.
Yeah. It's like an awesome back and forth.
Yeah.
It's like dating. I mean, your partner says something and like they compliment you. I mean, you're probably going to compliment them back.
Yeah.
You know?
And if you don't, it's probably because you have your own issues you're working through.
Yeah, you might need to work on it a little bit.
Yeah. And so, what are some different ways that worship looks like? Because I know a lot of people do the corporate music worship in the West, and there's different styles and all that. But what does that look like?
Yeah, I think even in talking back to Jesus, talking to the Samaritan woman, he's literally saying like, worship is not at the temple. It's not, you don't have to travel to go do it anymore. And so he's saying it doesn't look like something that only happens on a Sunday morning, like in our culture, in a church building, but it's actually something you can do all the time. And so worship isn't just, like I said, from a guitar or piano, but it's in every act that we do. I mean, it's an action, right? And so even like you using your gift of speaking and like building people up and like provoking thoughts in the form of podcasts for the kingdom of God. Yeah. This is worship, and people don't realize that they're worshiping something, you know? Mm-hmm. And it might be because the word worship is like, I don't know. You don't just go around telling people like, what are you worshiping? Yeah. Sounds a little strange, right? But we literally, just like how you're saying, you know, prayer and worship, they're the same, but prayer is always happening. It's conversation with God. Yeah. And God's always speaking. And so worship is always going on. And so worship looks like all of your actions. It's where your heart is. It's a heart placement.
Yeah. I would even want to like maybe have us tackle this, like, because some people like, they love the music stuff. They're cool with it. Some people aren't. And that's like an extreme over here. Yeah. And then there's an extreme over here that goes, let's go like absolutely wild during worship. We don't care what we do.
Let's get the flags out.
Get the flags out. Let's like roll on the ground, whatever it is. Let's dance. And so there's like kind of this spectrum or like wheel going on about all these different ways to do it and how it looks. And we're talking about corporate worship, of course. Yeah. Like I said, there's lifestyles of worship. Okay. But in this corporate worship, like, what would you say to people that say it has to look a certain way? Whether they say it has to be super expressive or they say it needs to be very reverent and look a certain way like that. Yeah.
You know, a good friend told me this. If you are judging someone, you're assuming that you know. And if you assume that you know anything more than God does, you're putting your own opinion above God's opinion. Yeah. So I think both should be honored. If people want to stand and not raise their hands during worship and probably just prefer the message, cool. Like, but if people love to dance and they love worship and they might fall asleep during the message, like, you know, we're just all so different and we all connect with God so differently that it's not meant to look one way. And so I think if you think it's meant to look one way, I think it's probably coming from a place of judgment.
Yeah. And I've heard kind of a talk on that before about how worship is like this other focus on God, and how can I say, like, in the defining it, it's like this, our gaze narrowing on him who captivates us. And so when you start thinking about other people, it's like, well, now you're thinking about how the people look and what they're doing, and maybe even somebody gets self-conscious about you, and it's like you begin to limit your ability to experience God, which is part of that worship. Mm-hmm. And so what would you say, Alec?
I think it's just really important to, figure out how you worship best. Sometimes I'll just like sit down and like have quiet time with God in the middle of it, or sometimes I'll be like, you know, jumping around, or, you know, I've never run across the stage, but it could happen, like across the aisle or whatever. Seen some people do it. But yeah, I mean, taking it outside of like, you know, an actual like musical setting, just like being in my room and like, hey God, like what are you doing right now? And like start speaking to him. And in that, like checking my heart where it's at. And even like I'm an external processor, I've learned. And so as I'm talking to people, like I'll just start processing things, and the Lord will start bringing me new things. And a lot of it, it's like, oh wow, I hadn't even realized that I was like doing a certain thing, but then he'll kind of show me the reasoning for why I've been doing it. And so in that, my heart is like turned to him fully, and I'm like, hey God, let's go deeper in this. And so in the moment, I'm like maybe talking to one of you guys, but I'm actually like, processing something with the Lord and like going really deep. And so I think it's just really important to know, like, okay, where is my heart right now? And like, where is my mind going? And in that, like, finding God in it. For me, it's just like, you know, always worshiping. And so now I'm like in that mindset of like, oh yeah, I'm just always listening to God. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So how kind of I would tackle that point. It's just to say like, you may have a verse, a scripture, or a reason to back up the reason you think that people should worship a certain way in the corporate setting. And my response to you is going to be, if worship is simply that outward expression, then how do you explain it changing over time? And are you trying to say that we must do a certain thing to please God? And while I think there are things that are pleasing to God, my point is we need to take a step back from a performative approach and go, it's all about the heart. I think that's something Jesus teaches very early on in the Sermon on the Mount. It's all about the heart. And you get the heart wrong, it doesn't matter what you do next. And so we can start talking about maybe orderly stuff and all that. If you can get to the point of going, as long as the heart's in the right spot, that's the point of worship. It's the heart response to experiencing the spiritual connection of God. And so my challenge is just, let's look past what we think it's supposed to look like, and let's just go, it doesn't matter what it looks like to everyone else. Like, if that person's heart is deeply experiencing God and responding in joy, let it look how it looks, still or dancing or singing or whatever it looks like.
Yeah. I feel like that just goes back to being open, like, for God to do whatever he wants to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like letting go.
Yeah. It's a willingness to let him do it.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Kind of one thing I want to hit before we move on from this point of defining worship. You're a worship leader. You lead a church, you lead small groups, you play in your room by yourself. Like, you lead worship. One of your primary ways you do that is through music. And so what do you experience? We're talking about this experience of God and all that. And so just maybe can you elaborate what that experience is?
Like in the midst of leading worship?
Yeah, what's the heart posture?
Yeah. So this was like a big learning curve for me, probably like a decade of a learning curve. Because basically, to run you through it, like as a kid worshiping by myself alone, a weight was lifted off. I was having like an intimate time with God, and then as soon as I started worship leading in youth in 6th grade, then it was like I'm really nervous to lead worship. And so I've never had experienced that before that time. And so what it was when we're nervous, we're thinking about ourselves.
Yeah.
We're thinking about how we look, how we're being perceived in the moment. And so I went from 6th grade till I was about 20 years old, just always being really nervous while like leading worship. And so looking back on it now, I'm like, man, I spent so many years of my life just wondering what people thought of me in the midst of worship, which you feel like you're in a cage, and it feels like you just can't worship, even alone anymore. Like, I wouldn't worship as much alone just because, I was doing it, and now nerves were involved. And so I think by the time I was 20, 21, I finally started to grasp onto the idea that, you know, worship isn't about me, and it's not about how well I do it or what people think by the end of it, but it's actually about, like we were saying, sacrifice. It's about God. It's about like pouring out my love on God in the midst of worship. And so it took a while, but probably over after like a year and a half. So this is pretty recently. It's like I'm now in the position where I can lead worship and not feel nervous because I understand fully it's not about me. And I don't want any part of me associated like being lifted up. And it's kind of hard because, I mean, you look at worship and you look at music in our culture, and you have famous people, you have like all the pop stars, and they're like, man, you're so musically talented, like you're just a great worshiper, you just did so good. And it's so, I can see how it's really easy to get so like consumed in yourself in the midst of worship. But like I said, it's like you're in a cage, and so I never want to go back to that. I always want to be in the moment and just pour everything out that I have onto God in the midst of worship. So I think being a worship leader, that is the struggle that worship leaders often face. And I'm just like extremely blessed to be surrounded by other worship leaders older than me who are able to kind of guide me and be good mentors of getting me out of that that place.
Yeah, it's kind of like, and this applies not just to worship, but how we like handle ourselves and approach speaking or leading or all these different avenues of things. And it's like, if you get to this place where you have to achieve, perform, or put on a certain appearance in order to secure yourself based on the perception of others, what we've now done is try to go into a false self. We've tried to go in a false appearance. And the reason that is because of insecurity. And so I think just to like get in that place back to true worshiper, it's like, let me find myself so secure with the way that God feels about me. It doesn't matter how I look, sound, feel, but I know that he is pouring his love out on me. And so it makes it easy to pour back on him and not care what anyone else thinks. I even talked a little bit last week on the Investigators to Adventure episode about how like the person who is in love doesn't care what anyone else thinks. They're willing to make themselves absolute fools to express it. And so that's like almost just gliding through to the fact that like, hey, I can express this without remorse or fear because this is simply my response to it. And there's no other response I have but to look how I look. And it may look cool to you, it may not, but that's not my concern.
Come on. That's good.
David.
Yeah. Dance naked in the streets.
Yep.
Yeah. Even if your wife thinks you look crazy.
Yeah. That's rich, dude.
And so, so we kind of looked at defining worship, some characteristics of worship and corporate worship and all of that. And I want to kind of move on to this point of the connection between worship and prayer. And so talk about a little bit at the beginning about how this communication of God, this communion with God, this connection of God, this inner dwelling that he has in us, I think there's something that connects all those functions of prayer, discernment, conviction, our adoration, and then worship in it within that is like not separate from prayer. And so what I would say about prayer is that it's our exchanging of ourselves with God, this allowing of inner dwelling between the two. And so it's this thing that allows us to experience that union that was formed by way of the cross. And so therefore worship itself is prayer. It's this exchange, we're talking about this sacrificial exchange of self. And so as we commune with God, we give ourselves to him, and it unlocks this response, and the only response, that it's possible to go to the depths of him and experience joy and gratitude. And so we're just going to speak in the context of connection with him. Like, we don't have to break it down into systems or different categories, but worship and prayer are interlocking. And so any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting how we've put such a line in between prayer, like speaking, and then worship, where we're just singing.
Yep.
Because it's both two things that just come from within us and comes from our voice, but yet we've put such a line, it's like, this is prayer, this one's worship. And so
it's a little rigid.
We differentiate them, but like even hearing you like talk about it now makes me think like, you know, we're both are still to Jesus, you know, nothing really changed. It's still us saying something to Jesus. One's just talking, one's just singing.
Yeah,
you know?
and you don't have to. If we have to flip a switch to a different like thing, it's not the case. It's the same thing. And so
Yeah,
even like I think when people do spontaneous worship and they sing just like these songs within the songs they're singing, that's just prayer with them singing. That's just them like they would probably pray the same things with just the simple words.
literally. It makes me think of like really what was worship to people in the Bible. Like I'm sure they sing. They absolutely sing, but I just would love to see what other ways they worshiped God, because I'm guarantee you it does not look like what it looks like to us today.
And I mean, I think usually what it would have been was like, you know, the early church in Acts just gathering around the table. And so in that it was like we're just sitting together talking, eating and praying, and like that was worship to them. And so like I know in our modern day, and we've talked about it a few times already, like worship can be so seen as just like heavily music based. But even just opening up the possibilities to like, you know, what we're doing right here, right now, like you said earlier, was worship. And it's like it's glorifying God. And in that, it's like our hearts are fully in it, our hearts are fully pointed towards Him. And if we all know that, it's like we're actively seeking God in this as well. And so, like, why couldn't this be seen as worship?
Right.
Yeah. And that kind of getting around the table idea with the disciples, and we would do it in many different churches and formats, and there's different ideas behind it. But we talk about communion, the act of breaking the bread and sharing the wine, in remembrance of the body broken, the blood spilt, which is actually a representation of the new covenant being formed on the cross. And you see it as a way of forming covenants throughout Scripture. That itself is done in remembrance. It's done in response. And so what's happening, like I said, I really think that we have to grasp the idea that while a lot of these things we do have the spiritual context, our physical acts do not cause the spiritual. The spiritual is causes a response in the physical. And so as we do something like sharing communion, what's happening is we're engaging with the spiritual reality of the cross. And we might feel something in that, and we can engage in that, but even that itself is this act of worship to just respond to what's happening, what God is doing in us.
That's good.
Yeah, bro. And so talking about this connection between worship and prayer, what are some examples of how you worship just beyond music?
So beyond music, I like to worship God by like working out. I think I used to run a lot more, but now with my health, I'm getting more back into lifting, and I think that's totally an act of worship of like taking care of your temple. Because I mean, even the idea of that, like you don't go to the temple to worship anymore, but where you're at, God is in you, and it's like taking care of your temple is definitely an act of worship. And so being healthy, I think reading, strange enough, is like an act of worship, because it's not necessarily your physical, but it's your mental. And so I think I probably covered this in different areas, but like physically I work out, mentally I read like the Bible, or I read books that are healthy for my mind. Spiritually, I'd say that's where the music kind of comes in, because that's like super spiritually giving for me. But then also community, relationally, like big time. Telling people about Jesus, but also just being friends with people and doing family really well is like a big act of worship for me.
Yeah, it's kind of like we're talking about this response to God. It's like you're choosing a response. It's either going to be one to include Him and acknowledge Him and honor Him, or it's going to be a response to try to exclude Him and disconnect. And so all those things, it's like you're choosing to connect with God, and you're choosing to show up with Him. You're choosing to do it because you love what He's made, and He's made you, and you want to take care of yourself. And so I would say even one for me is kind of the idea of honor. Like if I can just find a deep sense of honor, the deep sense of weightiness to other people, and even as Paul wrote, to no longer regard anyone from a earthly point of view. And what I think he means by that is not simply like to go, yeah, like there's more to life, but to go, how God sees people is how I want to see people. And once you start seeing other people that way, it's easy to start seeing creation that way in life and this whole adventure with God. And so everything is like this big, giant expression of how God sees it. And once we lock eyes with how He sees it, we get to just enjoy the beauty of it. Nothing is mundane, nothing is simple, nothing is purposeless. And so everything we do has a element of an act of worship, because we get to figure out if we're going to decide to respond in union or disconnection.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah. I think bringing like other people into it too. There's a lot of like presence involved in it, and so whenever we're caught up in worshiping, it's like other people can feel it too. Um, I think there's a lot of like servitude in that as well. Like whenever Aaron and I were in Japan, we were just walking around and like, you know, carrying the presence with us, and people were like, "Hey, what is this? Like, what am I feeling right now? What am I like kind of entering into?" And so it's like in our moments of worship, it may have just looked like walking around or like just talking to people, but in that there was something that other people found too, and it was like an invitation for them to enter into worship as well, just like in community with us, just talking, doing life together, being around the table together with them. So even like they didn't know who Jesus was, they had no clue like what they were entering into, yet they still found peace and love and just the presence of God in it, which is something really cool to experience. So it's like while we're worshiping, it's not just us that are gaining something from it, it's actually like overflowing onto others as well.
Yeah, it's like everyone gets to experience what you experience when they get
Right.
to even just viewing and being in the same like atmosphere. And I kind of what we're doing in this conversation right now is actually we're kind of making this jump from going what is worship to what is a life of worship.
Yeah.
And so I even just want to kind of write that a little bit of like we do our individual acts, we have our set apart time, and sometimes we do intentional things to worship God. But we're kind of starting into this realm of everything is worship when you see it from the point of experiencing God within it. And so it's like we're not just setting apart time to play music. We're not just even doing those other things we talked about of how we worship and how we honor people and all of that. But we're also going, okay, God's included in every single thing I do. How can I not only experience Him but acknowledge Him and have gratitude in it? And so that's the leap from these ideas of worship and how it looks and how it feels and all this to go. And now let's see what it means to do it all the time in every single thing I do. Can I wake up in a posture of worship?
Yeah. Wow. That is a big thought. I think it takes some serious intentionality to walk it out every second, because we're people who constantly just have our minds going different places. And so it's like, it really is like, how do I walk it out at all times? And it's like worship without ceasing, right? It's how is the overflow of my life just worship on God? And so I think it first starts with your heart, like we've been saying, but it's also, that's just the byproduct of your actions.
Yeah. And so kind of that, like you're talking about, your mind goes everywhere. We're going to hit kind of this next section about worshiping without ceasing.
Yeah.
So there's this idea of praying without ceasing in Scripture. Paul mentions it. It's something that a lot of early church fathers do. It's what a lot of monks and what we'd call Christian mystics. The Christians are obsessed with the mystery of God and just experiencing the presence all the time. And it's the praying without ceasing that is like the central defining point of them. That they're always experiencing this deep connection with God that is honestly kind of makes you go, they're experiencing the reality that we're all meant for. And so if we're putting worship into the context of prayer, this is an element of exchange that should be able to be happening all the time. And this guy that I read, he writes his book called Letters of a Modern Mystic, and it's life-changing. It's short, but it's kind of these letters he's writing about trying to experience God all the time and acknowledge Him all the time. And this is what he says. He says that it seems impossible to focus on God all the time because we have so many thoughts and so many things happening, and he even struggles to do it. But the thing that changed the way he views this and made it possible for him to do it was to realize that you never actually think about one thing at a time. The way we actually think is in relation to things. And so we've probably spoken about it before in other episodes, but it's this idea that when you see something, you connect it to something else, and that's how you put relevance and context in your mind and remember it and have feelings toward it. And so the simple example I love to give is, hey, Aaron's my friend because I know he's my friend. I feel comfortable with him. I can talk with him. If I didn't know him, he was a stranger, I wouldn't treat him that way. And I'm not actively thinking through that, but it's because I know that now I know how to respond. And in the same way, we treat everything with God. That everything is made by God, for God, through God, to express him and for us to enjoy him. And so everything actually should be able to make a connection, and a very obvious connection to God.
So like associating everything you see, everyone you see with God.
It's a deep association, yeah.
Wow, yeah. That's a crazy way to put it.
And then the next step is that's prayer. Worship is in many ways prayer.
Yeah.
So that's possible all the time.
To constantly worship.
Yeah. And so kind of
Come on.
One thing I want to ask you is just like, how do you stay in that posture of worship? What are the practices? What are the thoughts you allow yourself to have? What do you do routinely? What are those checks you do on yourself? How do you stay in that posture of worship?
Dude, I hum a lot.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it today. I was like, I knew we were going to talk about worship. And I was like, man, like, I knew we were going to talk about ceasing to worship, or worship without ceasing. And I was like, dude, I hum all the time. And it's something that I grew up and my friends would be like, dude, shut up. Like, you're just singing the whole time. But I literally, like, something will trigger my mind, and, like, I'll hear something and I'll be like, start humming an old hymn or a worship song that's just been on my mind lately. Or even, like, I see people and I'll be in public, and I feel like God asks me this question, but it comes to my head a lot. And I'm like, what if everyone in this room, what if everyone in this restaurant just hit their knees right now and started worshiping God? It's like, how would that look? And then I just like close my eyes and visualize it. So I think for me to kind of stay in that posture, I think I just love music so much to where I have the triggers in my head of like, I see something and then I start thinking of a worship song. Or I'll be in a public place and I love worship so much, and I'm such a child in the moment of it where I'm having so much fun with it, to where I'm like, what if everyone just started worshiping right now? It's kind of like, it's almost like dopamine. It's like, what if we just did this right now? Like, what if we just start worshiping right now? Yeah. And so I think my love for worship and, music is really my trigger for, like, I constantly stay there because I actually love that place.
Yeah, it's almost like you're imagining what everyone's response should be to God. Like if everyone just knew how much God loved them, how much he cared, how present he was, this would be their response. Mm-hmm. And if we knew the extent of it, like if we really not only knew it but believed it, the extent of how present and real and how much he loved us, that would be our response. Everyone would drop to their knees and just be in awe. And that's even in many ways how heaven's described. Everyone's just like focused on him and praising him. And so I love that's the idea. And so it's almost this imagination factor, and that's one of my favorite tools to practice prayer, like without ceasing, because I consider myself in many ways a Christian mystic, just focusing on those mysteries and connection with God all the time. And so you might have got that impression of me in our friendship, but
a little bit.
And so there's been many like sustained periods where I go, oh my gosh, I think I've thought about God for weeks straight. Without stopping. And like I said, it's not always this direct praying, thinking thing, but it's this ability to associate everything with him and know his presence. And so, like one of my things I do very similar, I imagine. And the imagination is one of the greatest gifts, I think. I think one of the guys at our church calls it like a holy imagination or something, just to envision like holiness and God and all that. Yeah. And so kind of one of the final questions I want to ask you, particularly on this thing, is like, so we talked about worship and how it's like prayer, and kind of break it down into more just everyday life with God. What do you do? In what ways do you practice connection with God?
I try my best to sit and let like my words be his words, and let my ears be his ears, and let even like what I imagine be his imagination. And so time alone in my room worshiping just looks like me with a guitar, or me just praying, and I just give him space, and I say, I'm just going to play these chords, and if my ears hear some place to go, then I start playing new chords. And it's like stepping outside of your house and saying, God, just like tell me where I'm gonna go, and then I just do it. And so it looks like obeying, really,
Yeah.
which might not sit well with people, like the idea of obedience or obeying, like something you hear. But
Yeah, there's some resistance.
yeah, but it's actually so much fun to just be like, Father, let's go on an adventure, and that's just what I try and do, and worship.
Yeah, it's almost kind of that idea of spontaneous worship applies to just the way we live our life, where um, we're simply responding to what God's doing in the room and we follow it, and we find obedience not for the sake of hitting all the rules, but we find obedience and we apply it because we're removing resistance. So obedience is more of a describer than a doer. Obedience is describing the fact that I'm removing the resistance I have to what God's doing and I'm going with it. And so I would welcome people into obedience. So that's probably one of the greatest things you could ever do with your spiritual walk, is to practice obedience. And not obedience, like I said, not obedience is not I'm doing something to do it and to hit the mark, but obedience is actually removing the resistance I have to what God's doing in the room. And so it's like this awareness: what's He doing? Where can I follow Him? How can I experience Him in this moment?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and we really appreciate you sharing your heart. And so kind of what we talked about in this idea of a life of worship, that kind of defining worship, that it's our very being experiencing His goodness and responding in joy and gratitude. And so much of our physical is a response to the spiritual, and how we choose to do that is going to define if we're going to worship. And then there's a connection between worship and prayer, that they're very much facets of the same thing, that it's our connection with God and how we choose to express it. And this idea of a true worshiper, that it's somebody that chooses to engage with the dance of life. And then we talked about worshiping without ceasing, that it's something that is always possible. It doesn't have to look a certain way. It can be in many different ways and different forms, but the point is that you're doing it with connection. And so, Aaron, why don't you give us your final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say for anyone listening who just really loves worship or is even a worship leader, I think one big obstacle that I overcame was the mindset switch of seeing worship as a performance into seeing worship as an opportunity. And so I think every time you go into worship, anytime you're at a worship night or you're worshiping in ways that don't involve music, like lifting, like look at it as an opportunity to glorify God rather than inwardly looking and trying to perform. And I think you'll find yourself in a place of obedience and also just like a lot lighter.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Alec?
Yeah. I think for me, one big thing that I, still struggle with sometimes is comparison. And it's like comparing myself to other like speakers, musicians, friends, whatever it may be. But just kind of like giving that to God, and like during worship, exploring it and just asking like, hey, what do you see? Like, what do you love about me? Where do you want me to go? And through that, like, just being obedient.
Yeah.
And from there, like, yeah, just leading a good life of worshiping Him and glorifying Him in everything that I'm doing, and focusing solely on Him rather than like, well, this person might be better at it, so let's let them do it instead. It's like, no, God, I'm actually going to choose to focus fully on you right now and keep my heart like positioned towards you.
Yeah. He wants your all, and He doesn't care what it looks like.
Yeah.
It's all about the posture of your heart and the fact that your position's with Him. And so thanks for listening, guys. Thanks, Aaron, once again for joining us today. We have an Instagram that you guys can keep up with us. We post reels, we post updates, all kinds of things. It's going to be Beyond the Veil _podcast. That's Beyond the Veil _podcast. We have the same name on YouTube. So if you prefer to watch, we have a YouTube video up. And like I said, just keep up with us. We want to make sure to get this content to people to really edify and give value to people's life and kind of help move the needle in their spiritual walk. And so if it was meaningful, make sure to share it, make sure to review it, give a rating to help us get that to people. And so thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.